Hello, what is up YouTube? My name is G3 Iron, and today we are taking a look at a discussion that has generated some traction over the last 24 hours or so, and I wanted to share it all with you to have an extended discussion here in the community. Those of you that are new to the channel, you can like, subscribe, and ding the bell if you like discussions just like this one. Those of you who are veterans of the channel know the routine already. There are timestamps placed above my slightly balding forehead, just above you, and those are hot linked down below in the video description, as well as the link for all of the different discussions and website viewing traffic for your pleasure down in the video description down below. So let's jump right in. Here is the nature of the discussion. Enemies have too little health and deal too much damage. So, without further ado, let's jump in. This is a post from Scorpio Sound, and he begins. The game is currently so fast that it's causing problems in multiple areas. I do not think that our movement speed or attack speed or cast speed is a problem. Having high movement speed and attack cast speed helps the game feel smoother and more enjoyable. The problem is in how quickly we kill things and how quickly we can be killed. It's causing problems in the following areas, and likely others that I've not thought of too. So first off, he tackles melee. So we all know that melee is in a bad way. GGG will supposedly be fixing it in 3.7, although it remains to be seen what approach they take. However, melee's biggest issues are simply monster life and monster damage. Monster life is a problem because the game is currently in a state where everything that isn't a tanky rare or a boss gets one shot. We currently spend more time running to the next pack than we do fighting them. This is especially impactful for melee characters, and even more so for true melee characters who use single target or small AoE attacks, because they have to spend even more time traveling to enemies, making their clear even slower. If monsters had significantly more health, then the gap between melee and ranged characters would lessen significantly. Melee also feels bad in comparison to ranged characters because ranged characters can accidentally off-screen enemies. Again, due to our damage being so huge compared to enemies' health. I can't see GGG doing anything to address this problem in 3.7. Monster damage is also a problem for melee. Monsters do a lot of damage in high-tier maps or while delving. Melee characters have to be far closer to their enemies to deal damage, so they're far more likely to take damage. However, the defenses just aren't there to enable melee characters to take that level of damage. Armor does nothing against non-physical damage, and elemental or chaos damage is often the most deadly form of damage. And the way it scales means it's least useful against big hits when you need damage mitigation the most. Fortify is a great idea in theory, but it doesn't make up all the defenses a melee character needs. And although against the spirit of it, casters often gain access to Fortify too. So it doesn't really stand out as an advantage for melee characters. I suspect that Fortify support may see some changes in 3.7 so that it becomes a more desirable support gem for main skills, although I don't think this would be the right approach. I'm not a fan of support gems that you feel you have to take. Life. Characters in the bottom left of the tree do get access to more life than other areas of the tree. But it just isn't all that significant. It wasn't an incredible amount before this patch, but it really pales in comparison to all the ES that casters have access to now, or rather, that casters have always had access to, but has recently become much more usable for non-CI low-life builds, thanks to changes like Eldritch Battery and the ES Leech support gem. I imagine there will likely be more life added to the bottom left of the tree. It's a decent enough band-aid, but I'd rather monster damage be lowered instead for reasons I'll go into later. Melee characters just don't have the health and sustainability required to balance out the fact that they have to get so close to enemies. Alright, so moving on from melee now to talk about ailments and status effects. Ailments and status effects just aren't in a great place either, again due to enemies dying so quickly. I'll go through them individually. Shock, excluding builds that use either impulses and or are elementalists. When was the last time you factored in shock at all? It's not particularly valuable while clearing because everything gets one shot anyway, so you have no use for the increased damage. It's not great against most bosses because you can't do enough damage to shock them anyway. Unless you're using impulses or elementalist, it's often not worth trying to shock at all. Just using elemental focus support will be both higher and more reliable damage. If regular enemies had more health, then shocking them would actually be useful and could speed up killing them. Chill. This is nice against bosses, but it's not often while clearing that you'll have any desire to chill enemies. Why chill them when you could simply one-shot them instead? Freeze. Probably the ailment in the worst place. You want to freeze enemies to trigger Herald of Ice explosions and to shatter corpses. But when was the last time you wanted to freeze an enemy without it being for one of those reasons? Bosses are mostly immune to freezes due to their high health pools, so they're not useful there. It's so rare that an enemy has a small enough health pool that you can freeze it and not one-shot it, but also is enough of a threat that you want to freeze it. Freeze as an ailment as opposed to as a Herald of Ice or corpse destruction enabler is basically useless in the current state of the game. Burning and Ignite. I'm grouping these together because they're functionally the same. Dots in general are in a weird place, again due to enemies dying too quickly. There's no point in inflicting dots to complement your hit damage because you can just one-shot with your hits instead. When we're killing as fast as we do, dots have to kill effectively instantly or they feel bad in comparison. There are a couple of Ignite builds that feel okay at the moment, but even then, you have to hit the enemies, and rather than them dying instantly, you have to wait for their health to drain, so it's slower than a hit-based build. There's never a moment in the game, in its current state, where you're playing a hit-based build and want to ignite an enemy for the extra damage it deals. The Ignite damage itself, not for indirect damage due to combustion support or other mechanisms. The damage is A, irrelevant because ignites suck at the moment without investment, but more importantly B, irrelevant because 99% of the enemies will already be dead from the hit. Poison. It's a similar problem to Ignite. The enemy has to survive for the ailment to even do anything. Poison suffers even more though because it relies on multiple instances, so it takes far longer for damage to ramp up. Poison has its own issues on top of that, with Assassin being the only way to reliably make it viable at the moment. But even if it was more accessible for other ascendancies, it's just bad for clearing, where you want upfront damage in the current meta. Bleed. I almost forgot to add this. It's the very last thing I'm typing. Yeah, so Bleed exists. It's not particularly good, in large part because elemental and chaos damage are so much stronger than physical damage at the moment. And again, because upfront damage is so much better when monsters die so quickly. It can be okay if you get a very well-rolled weapon and invest in a bleed, but it doesn't feel great for clearing. As an aside, seeing as I've mentioned the state of dots a couple of times, cold dots and chaos dots are currently very strong. However, this is mostly because they kill so quickly that they might as well be considered one-shots while clearing. They do feel different while bossing or against high health enemies though, which they should. They have very consistent high sustained damage and allow for much more focus on positioning than hit-based builds. However, their damage can't be pushed as high. Dying to one-shots. Monsters' damage is so high relative to our health pools that we usually only die to one-shots or to multiple hits in such quick succession that it might as well have been a one-shot. When was the last time you died by attrition or got beaten down into submission, not just hit once, to the point where you had to back off and recover? Deaths are so quick that a half-second lag spike can kill you, and it's not uncommon for players to not even understand what killed them. Monster damage being so high also means that investing into defense just isn't worth it beyond a certain point for most builds. You need to meet a certain threshold where you can survive small hits, but beyond that, the best defense is for everything to be dead. Some enemies will one-shot you, or as good as, whether you stack defense or not, so the best thing to do is just dodge their hits and kill them as quickly as possible. Flasks. Flasks suffer both due to how quickly we clear and how susceptible to one or two shots we are. Most players use an instant health flask because if you survive a hit, you're likely to be on such low health that you need to recover instantly before another hit comes in that finishes you off. It's only really at the beginning of a new league on your first character where life flasks have any kind of interesting interaction. You can sustain if you manage your flasks properly, but you can't just spam them because you'll be using charges more quickly than you can generate them. Combat feels far more tactical and engaging at this point in the game when you're having to fight enemies rather than just exploding them and moving on. And they can be dangerous to you, but not lethal if you manage it at all properly. Whereas late game, you press your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 key and every 5 seconds, and you don't even think about the flash charges unless it's a boss fight. So he's got some solutions. Most of the time, dear G3 YouTube community, most of the time I don't dive into these kinds of conversations and these sorts of arguments because a lot of the time people don't offer solutions. So this is key here. Those of you that are wondering, hey, Iron, why is it that sometimes you pick certain things to feature and other things you don't? Because I don't think that just offering critiques is that valuable. Almost anybody can simply offer a critique. I was watching a sporting event the other day, and somebody that I was interacting with at the time, I shared a clip of the sporting event with them. They are somebody who is not sporting interested at all whatsoever, and they simply watched the play and said, oh, you're not supposed to do that. They were able to offer critique, but they were not able to offer a solution. Almost anybody, regardless of your level of actual knowledge of the topic, can offer a critique and see when something is going wrong. What is difficult is to actually offer solutions for improvement, and this user actually does that. So let's dive into those solutions that he offers. The obvious solution is to increase monster health and lower monster damage. It's especially obvious that I'd suggest it, seeing as my whole post is on the topic of problems that are caused by low monster health and high monster damage. Ideally, it'd need to be pretty huge changes. I'd personally start in the region of 4 times health, 1/4 damage, and work from there, but it'd need to be gradual so the community doesn't backlash too much. I'd love to see GGG run short, perhaps 2-week mini leagues as a test bed for broad changes like I've suggested. We know how important community-wide feedback is to them in their design process, and it'd be a great opportunity for them to get a wider testing done. Anyway, that's my essay for now. I'd love to hear your thoughts from anyone else on the topic. Okay, so I've got several different topics to cover on this because this particular user, which I want to give him credit for it, Scorpio Sound, has done such a great job articulating so many different things. Not everything that he's written do I simply blatantly agree with, nor does everything that he's written do I simply blatantly disagree with. I think there's a lot of good thoughts here. I think some of the problem is going to be inherently built in the model of grinding gear games and the business model of Path of Exile in particular. So we're going to start with the end first and then work our way back from there. The suggestion that so many people have had to run mini leagues, to run smaller leagues, is simply not viable right now for Path of Exile as a business model. Okay, all of their MTX, all of their sales, all of their supporter packs are all tied around, all of their business numbers are tied around 4 leagues. For those of 4 leagues per year. For those of you that are unfamiliar with why they do this, it's because they separate leagues based on quarterly numbers that are there to help them manage quarterly sales numbers, quarterly expense reports, quarterly investment numbers that they need to report back to their investors. So, for those of you that are saying, oh, why is it that GGG doesn't just take more time and have less leagues, or why is it that they don't do more leagues and spend less time making them and make them smaller? Either way, right now, where GGG is that they're at a stage in their business model where they are dependent on 4 league cycles per year, and that's their business model. Everything is tied to those 4 league cycles. They don't necessarily make a ton of money outside of those 4 major releases or 4 major business cycles for them. That's where their bread and butter is. So I know a lot of you out there just want to talk about game mechanics. I know a lot of you out there just want to talk about game development from a theoretical standpoint. I hate to break it to you and be the nasty person that says, oh, there are people who actually, work at Grinding Gear Games who do a great job building this game, and it's their job. It's their job to go into work and to improve the game for us as a community. But I need to bring that up because that's the reality of it. So while there may be a great suggestion in theory to say, hey, maybe they'll try and test run mini leagues, or maybe they'll try and change their development cycle. It's simply not feasible for a company at this stage in their growth and at this stage of their success to say, you know what we should do? We should change our entire business model to test some things out for the community. Because companies that do that oftentimes don't recover if things go poorly. It's simply not worth it. The risk reward isn't, oh, well, we'll try this and then we'll go back to it if it doesn't work. No, it's people get laid off, people lose their jobs, people that you work around on a daily basis that you enjoy working around potentially could not be here anymore if you screw up on this sort of decision. So, business discussion aside, the second thing that I wanted to bring up here, mini leagues are kind of already happening. GGG wants to test run some things. It's kind of already happening. So do you remember how I just said, hey, GGG's never going to officially do that and change their development cycles? One of the things that GGG has sneakily done, and it's very clever. I don't say it's sneaky in like a, oh, ha, we're maniacal, evil people. Villainy, not in that way, right? They're not clever in that way, but rather in a very clever game development manner that allows them to test some things without the risk of throwing their entire player base into a potential chaos confusion spiral, is the opening of private leagues. So when you remember back to when private leagues were enabled, private leagues only enable you to make the game easier. What's that? I can't hear you, YouTube. No. Not make the game easier. Make the game harder. To slow the game down, to make the game more difficult, to make monsters have more health, to make monsters do more damage, to make your item drops and the things that you can acquire to be more restrictive. Those are the sorts of difficulties that GGG has opened the door to, and it's done it not in a mini league officially, but in several mini leagues, in private leagues. So I want to offer some encouragements. This particular user, as he's offering this suggestion for mini leagues, he's wrong in that GGG's probably never going to do that, but he's right in the suggestion that GGG is looking at those private leagues and going, what are the player numbers for these private leagues? And what are the most popular things going on in these private leagues? There is no doubt whatsoever that on the back end they're looking at that to say, what is it that some of our most hardcore dedicated players who have to pay to access these leagues, private leagues are pay to play, people who are paying to get into these private leagues, what are some of the most popular mods? Is it that they're slowing the game down? And is that something that our player base who pays to play the game would actually like to interact with, is a more difficult version of Path of Exile? All right, so we've already taken care of the business side. We've now taken care of how GGG is actually implementing private leagues to try and gather some of this feedback about slowing the game down, about changing monster health, and about changing some of the player power creep that is going on. Now I want to talk about flasks. Flasks have been changed for better or for worse forever. We've seen that happen over the last year. Several different immortal builds that used to be enabled because of flasks are now dead. GGG has wanted to make sure that flasks are very, very powerful for a very specific set of characters. Namely, the best way to get the most out of flasks is to ascend as a Pathfinder. Pathfinder has rotated outside of the meta. Presently, it's still there. It's still present. People still play Pathfinder. It's not like Slayer, where the percentages are really, really low. They are lower than what they used to be. But flasks in and of themselves, I just disagree. I don't think that flasks in and of themselves are that big of a problem in terms of this bigger discussion about monster health. Rather, I think the problem that happens here with flasks is what you point out here in this particular discussion, is that early on, where is it that he says this? It's really only at the beginning of a new league on your first character where life flasks have any kind of interesting interaction. I think you are spot on about this, because Path of Exile by nature is a game that as you acquire more currency and more items and you have more options for your character, you get to min-max your character further. So I think in the midst of this discussion about adding monster health, I think a discussion needs to be had about whether or not Path of Exile for league starters is a problem, is a good thing, or whether or not Path of Exile monster health for people who have got tons of currency or an endgame character even. You might not have a ton of currency, but you might have an endgame character, let's say floating in between level 90 to level 95, which isn't where most of the player base actually gets to every league, but let's just say an endgame character in between level 90 to 95. Is that where the problem actually lies? Is the problem actually as you're leveling through the story? Is monster health the problem there? Or is monster health the problem as you're mapping and pushing for endgame towards level 100? Here's the reason why I bring this up. Grinding Gear Games has said multiple times that they want level 100 to be the pinnacle achievement of grinding through the game that is Path of Exile. They want that to be a difficult challenge for players to overcome, and they want that to be a challenge that not every player gets to. They want that to be a very, very small percentage of the community that gets to it. So much so that during Betrayal League, when pure Breachstones were flying around and were making it so that way, if you simply had enough currency, you could get to level 100 relatively quickly, GGG instantly came out, nerfed that, killed that, etc. And basically every single development cycle, whenever there is a new meta that comes out for rushing level 100, GGG has been known to nerf that particular meta for rushing level 100. So I think the discussion here actually segues into two potential different discussions. Is what we're discussing here, is what we're saying is a problem, is that monster health and player speed, player damage makes so many mechanics obsolete and really is detrimental to the state of the game. Is that because of the end game grind and monster health at the end of the game that you're simply blowing everything up, rushing to 100? Or is it because of the story? Because I think what we're seeing from player numbers is whenever there's a new league, and we're about to have a new league here with flashback synthesis, and then a new league after that for when 3.7 drops. Whenever there's a new league, there's new excitement and players come back. And I don't think it's just because of the hype of new mechanics. I think fresh economies and a fresh start to level characters through the story are actually something that attract a wide portion of the player base. Some of you are going to comment on this video and say, Iron, you're totally off base. Iron, you're so full of crap. People hate leveling. People hate going through the story. People just want to get to maps. I think some of you are right. There is absolutely a segment of the population that wants to do that. But there's also a segment of the population that levels a character, gets to maps, and you know what they do right after that? They go back to leveling another character. They hit level like 75, 80, and they go, okay, I've seen what this character can do. I got like some white maps down. This build really isn't that much fun anymore. I've had my fun with it. I've enjoyed it, but now I want to go try something else. A ton of people do that. And a ton of people play the game, no-lifing it for a few weeks at the beginning of a league cycle, and then they stop playing. So I think you might want to counter my argument or counter what I'm bringing up by saying, well, this is a systemic problem with the end game leveling. People don't want to continue leveling or continue interacting with the game because it becomes too easy once you've acquired certain amounts of gear and certain amounts of currency. That's fine. I think there's a discussion to be had there about the end game health and the end game status of health with monsters. But I think this particular point about the early game, and particularly at the beginning of a new league, a lot of players do have a great time and don't necessarily complain about all of these different mechanics and all of these different builds. It is a frequent meme when there is a new league that's coming out that people are trying to come up with new builds, because it doesn't matter what your build is at the beginning of a league. There's seemingly like endless possibilities for what you could potentially do and what jank meme build you could be running that particular league, or what very, very meta build you could be running, because the options are so wide and so diverse. Which brings me to the next thing, talking about all of these different ailments and status effects. Yes, I completely agree with the poster here that all of these different status ailment effects are not helpful as auxiliary or secondary effects. Totally agree with that. Totally agree that each one of these effects, when you look at the ailment effect versus the on-hit effect, you basically want to apply it as on-hit. That's a great observation. It's a great breakdown of where Path of Exile is at the moment. That being said, the point I want to raise on this topic of ailments and status effects, Path of Exile is such as a game about min-maxing that if there is a particular mechanic your build is going to employ, you are probably going to try to min-max the hell out of that particular mechanic because of the nature of this game. If your build is going to focus on dealing shock, then you want to make it deal as much shock as possible, have as much shock effect as possible, have as much radius as possible on all of your hits. You want to have as much proliferation as possible so that way the whole pack gets shocked. All of these wonderful things need to happen. And so, of course, impulses and elementalists are going to be the nature of the discussion of shock, because they're the ones that do that best. The same thing is true for chill, freeze, and burning ignite. All of these status ailment effects, I'll get to poison and bleed here in just a second. All of these elemental status effects are such that they are made to be effective, and most effective if you dump all of your focus into those things. So in part of his argument, when he's saying, look, you might as well just kill stuff with hits because hits are faster anyway. Yeah, that's something that you can do, and you can scale up each of these particular status ailment effects to do their best work on hits. So if the argument here is we want to have two very equal styles of play, one that revolves around dots and one that revolves around hits, I simply want to push back a little bit and say that's not a part of the design philosophy of Path of Exile. If you've got another game in mind that comes to mind with that design philosophy, cheers to you, enjoy that game. That's not what Path of Exile has ever been about. The elemental damage tooltip for cold, for lightning, and for fire have always been different, partially because of their by nature status ailment effects that come with each of them. Lightning is the one that rolls the highest wide variety of damage. It's also very low. It's got the potential to roll very low amounts of damage. So lightning has always been at the top there. That's a part of what makes lightning definitively lightning. Cold has got the ability to freeze and essentially stop things from moving on your screen. It's a very, very defensive mechanic. And so as such, its flat rolls are generally on the lower side. And then ignite, because fire damage can roll relatively well, relatively high amounts of damage, and has always had a lot of really great conversion through a couple of different ascendancies. Fire has been that middleman between lightning and cold that also has a solid dot effect, but you only can apply it once through burning and through ignites. Sorry, not through burning that you can apply once, but through an ignite only once. So Path of Exile has always had these kind of hallmark, disequal, imbalanced approaches to the numerical value and to the mechanical value of these different status ailments effects. It's tied into the very core of the game. So yes, it could be that GGG could eventually go back and say, you know what, these status ailment effects, we're just going to redo all of them and we're going to rework them and change the way how they work, especially in relationship to monster health and to monster damage. But I just don't think that's in the ethos of the game. That would really shake up the entirety of the game, and it would shake up all of our items. Okay, just think if they wanted to redo the numbers and the ailment status effects and how they work based on monster HP and based on their on-hit effects. Like it doesn't feel like that would really work in this game as we now know it. That would completely change the dynamics of the game. Okay, I promised that I would get to poison and bleed. So poison and bleed, two quick things here. You can still stack poison builds. Okay, poison builds are still a thing. We're a year and a half removed from poison double dipping being OP and flavor of the month. So those of you that are looking at the game now and saying, oh, but poison is crap now. A year and a half ago, it was amazing. Okay, before the most recent 2018 cycle, 2017, 2016, poison was amazing. So those of you that are saying, poison sucks now, why is it that poison sucks now? Can we please make it so that way poison doesn't suck now? What you're asking for is a rotating meta of what's popular. And by the way, that is totally in line with Path of Exile's design philosophy at the moment. They're rotating what's popular through the meta in terms of their ascendancies. We saw that with 3.6 and with 3.7. They're rotating with what style of content they want us to be playing as players by making some content more accessible and other content less accessible. This is totally in line with what GGG wants. So I'm not disagreeing with the poster here. I'm not agreeing with the poster here about poison. I'm simply saying, based on the development cycle and the rotating meta that is Path of Exile, we're probably going to see poison bounce back at some point. The same thing can be said for bleed, but for bleed, I can give you a little bit more of a definitive response. I think bleed is probably going to come back in a very, very strong way in 3.7. I don't have any kind of inside information about that. I'm wearing a red shirt. It's not like Iron's wearing a red shirt and he's talking about bleed. He must have some kind of knowledge that 3.7 is going to be a bleed league. I have no information. I'm just wearing a red shirt because that's what I'm wearing today. But I think bleed, it makes sense for bleed during a melee buff cycle to get buffed, to get changed. I think that's probably something that we are going to see in much a similar way to how we saw cold dots get changed all the way back in 3.5. All of a sudden, cold dot became the focus of one of the meta builds. I think we've seen GGG develop in their own in-house gameplay, testing through different leagues. The last 4 leagues, they've come out with 3 builds per league that have kind of been their hallmark test builds. And I want to say that started back in Incursion. At least when they started telling us about it, that was an Incursion. So we've heard about that for Incursion League, for Delve League, for Betrayal League, and for Synthesis League. So for the last 4 leagues, we've heard that internally they have about 3 different builds that they try out on 3 different ascendancies. I think one of the ascendancies is going to be a bleed-heavy build. I think we'll see that. I could totally be wrong on that. We'll visit that here in a month when 3.7 gets announced and we have all of the details about it. But I think Bleed is going to be getting some changes in interactions, similar to how several different builds saw changes in interactions over the last 2 leagues with 3.5 and 3.6, particularly Cold Dots and Chaos Dots. I think those are going to be some examples of how Bleed is going to get buffed and changed and become meta relatively quickly. Okay, so the first thing that he brought up is Melee, and of course Melee is coming in 3.7, so this is the last thing that I've got to say today. Yes, Armor sucks at the moment as it scales. Yes, Fortify is a great idea in theory, but it doesn't make up for all of the characters' internal deficiencies. I've heard several different suggestions about changes to Fortify. I think Fortify's changes probably will go either with a change onto the gem to where maybe it only supports melee skills. It could be that they use some sort of wording that it's like only supports, active non-movement based melee skills. Something really restrictive that says if you want to have Fortify now, we're pulling it off of any way to get it, other than simply having it being an active support gem on your main damaging skill. That's one way that they could do it. I don't know if that's what they're going to do. That's just one of the very, very restrictive things that they could do. GGG has a history of nerfing things very, very hard and then slowly rolling the power creep back out. See Energy Shield as an example, where Energy Shield got nerfed 3 years ago when it was meta. It got absolutely the axe chopped over it. Life has really grown since then, and then ES has slowly grown every single league until we're back in an ES infested meta right now in Synthesis. So I think Fortify will probably get some sort of major axe to it, which don't be surprised if that happens. Not because melee characters need to be nerfed in Fortify, but because they really want to specify that melee characters are the ones who need Fortify and who will greatly benefit from Fortify. So a random, crazy, hairy prediction then is that champion that has an ability to get to Fortify without using gem sockets, I think will actually be a massive, massive option for a lot of spellcasters in the upcoming meta in 3.7. I think a lot of spellcasters will actually use champion. If champion goes unchanged and Fortify really gets restricted to only melee usage, I think people who are spellcasters who want to have access to Fortify will indeed go champion. Now, that may be only in more hardcore settings, hardcore solo self settings, but I think if that's the changes that are coming to Fortify, then that's probably what will happen. That ascendancy will rise in popularity as that becomes one of the more popular and available ways to gain access to a huge amount of defensive layers. Last thing to say here, yes, Armor sucks. Yes, Fortify's got changes probably coming to it, but Life. Okay, so Life and Energy Shield have a constant cycle that they are going through every couple of years. One is going to be stronger than the other. At the moment, I just want to encourage us as a community to think about Life and Energy Shield in 2 different ways. It's generally cheaper to get a build started with Life early on in a league and then migrate to a more expensive option later on down the road with Energy Shield. I simply want to throw that out there. It's generally cheaper to get a character started with Life, and then as you accumulate currency and items later on in a league, migrate over to Energy Shield. I don't think, for some of you vets out there, you already know this, I don't think I'm saying anything earth-shattering here, but I think that's how we ought to approach Life and Energy Shield at the moment. And so when he says, I imagine there will be more life added to the bottom of the tree, it's a decent enough band-aid, but I'd rather more monster damage be lowered instead for reasons I'll go on to later. Life is going to get added to the tree. We saw ES get added to the tree all over the place. I'm expecting that big wheel behind Blood Magic to see a bunch of changes. We could see one of the archetype builds for this particular league cycle actually be like a Blood Magic build, which would be really, really cool, right? Because at the moment, there are so many things in the game that are stopping you from playing Blood Magic because you want to stack all of your mana away on really powerful auras. I think it would be cool to see that, but I think that's how we ought to think about Life right now. Life is going to get added to the tree, just like Energy Shield got added to the tree in 3.6. Life is going to get added to the tree in 3.7. And it's probably going to go on the bottom left-hand side of the tree. There's already a bunch of Life down there. So those of us that are starting league starters with Life-based builds, I think that's still a good thing to do because Life is, for the most part, still much, much cheaper than Energy Shield. But those of you that still like playing CI and still like playing Energy Shield builds and hybrid builds and low-life builds, that's fantastic. I think the general pattern right now, observational pattern, is that Life is cheaper, Energy Shield is more expensive, and that's a design principle that Path of Exile that GGG actually wants in place. And I think with 3.7, we will see life builds become even cheaper and even more effective than Energy Shield, just as we saw Energy Shield become even cheaper and more accessible and more powerful in synthesis. All right, that's a whole bunch of thoughts coming at you. I, again, just want to applaud Scorpio Sound for this awesome post and for this awesome discussion, because it's prompted so many different thoughts just for myself, so I've enjoyed this very, very much. But what are your thoughts and your ideas? Leave us a comment down below and let us know what you think are the changes that are coming up, and whether or not enemies having too little health and too little and too much damage is actually a problem in Path of Exile. I look forward to all of your comments and the discussion down below, and as always, I hope that today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you right after you get done watching this video.
Nice patrons, yes, good patrons. They're so kind and supportive.
I can't believe you watched that thing. That was a good job. You did it. You got through the whole video. Yay.